Humans are surprisingly irrational. Luckily, the mistakes we make are predictable, which makes them easier to prevent or correct. Flawed logic is an ordinary problem, which means that people use it in predictable ways. In The Art of Thinking Clearly 2013, Rolf Dobelli describes 99 of the most common cognitive errors to befall the human brain. People make the same errors in reasoning over and over again, often without ever realizing how far from rationality they have strayed. When we learn how to recognize these patterns in our own thinking, we can consistently make better choices and expect better outcomes. Cognitive errors can have positive or negative effects. When they're positive, cognitive errors can boost our self-esteem or tell a comforting story about the past. But negative errors have the potential to cause damaging repercussions in every area of life, including both personal decisions and business matters. For instance, even with the best intentions of making rational decisions about when to buy and sell stocks, many people approach the stock market in an emotional and reactionary way and feel special pressure when the tenor of the market is panicked. To prevent hasty or ill-considered actions, it's important to rely on logical tools that can help offset or, better yet, replace those emotions. The brain is capable of two primary modes of thinking: fast and slow. Fast thinking happens organically, involving quick, often automatic mental shortcuts. Slow thinking requires conscious, laborious effort and applications of logic. It also involves interrogating intuition and introducing skepticism to emotionally charged situations. Slow thinking gives people more control over their lives, guiding well-considered investment decisions and identifying major errors in logic before they can cause harm. But the world would come to a halt if everyone were to use slow thinking all the time. Thinking requires time and significant cognitive resources, so it's important to pick and choose the situations in which slow thinking should be applied. As a rule of thumb, slow thinking works best for decisions that are highly consequential, like big investments or life changes. When the stakes aren't so high, fast thinking will often suffice. Decision-making is an imperfect process, and it's perfectly fine to make mistakes when the consequences aren't important to save time and prevent stress. People often use mental shortcuts that lead them to make irrational decisions. The human brain relies on a variety of mental shortcuts that make it easier and faster to make decisions. These shortcuts effectively reserve cognitive resources that can be allocated to another task. But when the shortcuts lead to faulty reasoning, the outcome is negative and can even lead to damaging delusions about the world. One particularly troublesome mental shortcut is the availability bias, which relates to the way the brain constructs its idea of the world using the evidence that is conveniently top of mind instead of considering a full range of possibilities. This bad habit can lead to misconceptions and lazy stereotyping due to shallow thinking. Even people who go to the trouble to seek out new information tend to filter it through their existing expectations. For example, on the internet, people tend to choose their news sources based on pre-existing political opinions and ignore websites that cater to readers with different political values. People have a natural filter for information that doesn't align with their point of view, a cognitive error known as confirmation bias. Another cognitive error that people frequently make due to mental shortcuts is outcome bias. Often, people struggle to separate the outcome of an event from the decisions that led up to it. For example, a person reading about history might assume that a general who lost a battle made poor decisions. But the outcome of the battle doesn't necessarily reflect on the soundness of the decisions that led up to it. As the saying goes, hindsight is 20/20. It's much easier to understand the past than to predict the future. People tend to downplay the role that luck plays in both good and bad outcomes, making the false assumption that successful people are always informed and skilled, whereas unsuccessful people tend to be ignorant and unskilled. The pain of loss is more palpable than the pleasure of gain. Humans have an intense aversion to loss, so much so that they experience losses more acutely than gains. This phenomenon is known as loss aversion. Losing $50 feels roughly twice as bad as gaining the same amount of money feels good. That's why salespeople and other professionals who practice the art of persuasion will find it more effective to frame a product in terms of what won't be lost instead of what will be gained. For example, a new set of light bulbs should be described as a product that will prevent customers from losing money, as opposed to a product that will help them save money. It's a subtle but effective distinction. Loss aversion is related to another phenomenon known as the scarcity error, which occurs when people overvalue things that are in short supply. For instance, in galleries, owners place small red stickers under works that have been sold. This practice makes the remaining work seem more special because the supply is relatively scarce. Psychologically speaking, people like to have as many options as possible. When an option is removed, it becomes even more desirable. The pain of loss can lead to another type of cognitive error known as the default effect. People tend to favor the status quo because they find comfort in consistency. Any change to that consistency is perceived as a loss, which is naturally threatening and upsetting. Indeed, people will cling to default options that objectively put them at a disadvantage simply because the psychological pain is less intense than managing the mental discomfort of change. Many cognitive errors can be explained by evolutionary psychology. The way in which we think is a product of biology, and therefore a product of evolution. The problem is that the human brain was optimized for an environment that was very different from the one in which we now live. The modern brain is still in many ways a relic from the time of hunter-gatherers, when people lived in small groups and might be required to run from predators at a moment's notice. Quick reflexes and instant reactions were critical to survival, whereas pausing for deep reflection was unnecessary and even dangerous. The problem is that the contemporary human environment, which is often quite different from that landscape, requires deeper reflection. Many of the cognitive errors that are prevalent in contemporary society can be traced to the misalignment between the evolved brain and the demands of modern society. A common cognitive error that can be explained by evolutionary psychology is reciprocity bias. In the prehistoric world, hunter-gatherers used cooperation and community sharing as a survival strategy. Sharing resources with others was a form of risk management. A person who shared food could reasonably expect that the favor would be returned out of a sense of obligation. In today's environment, the deep need for reciprocity can be manipulated by people who are selling something. For example, a free sample in the grocery store might make a shopper feel obligated to buy the product. Another cognitive error that relates to evolutionary psychology is hyperbolic discounting, which is a term for the heavy value that people place on immediacy. Studies show that most people would rather receive $1,000 immediately than wait a month to receive $100. This phenomenon can be explained by animal instinct. For example, a rat would not sacrifice a piece of cheese today for the promise of 2 pieces later. People constantly overestimate their own capabilities. Most people are consistently overconfident, placing far too much faith in their own abilities, competence, and chances of success. One cognitive error that causes this overconfidence is survivorship bias, by which successful people are more visible in society than people who fail. For example, journalists are more likely to write a story about a successful restaurant or to profile a successful CEO than to write about businesses that fail or that flounder and never attain remarkable success. A cognitive error that promotes overconfidence is the planning fallacy, which often occurs when people create overly ambitious to-do lists. People rarely have a firm sense of what they can accomplish in a given day, so they tend to stack their task lists with too many items. This tendency grows worse in a group setting, causing people to underestimate the costs and risks involved with a given project. Overconfidence can extend into many other areas of life, including investments. The overconfidence effect leads people to overestimate their own expertise and predictive powers. But even experts cannot predict the future, so it's helpful to allow for a healthy amount of skepticism for any forecast. When people fail, they also tend to overestimate the degree to which external factors played a role. This phenomenon is known as the self-serving bias. Generally speaking, most people have difficulty accepting personal responsibility for their failures and overestimate the degree to which personal responsibility plays a role in their successful endeavors. A similar blame game takes place in the business world, where many CEOs will blame downturns in the company's fortune on external factors like exchange rates and attribute successful years to their own leadership. Another cognitive error that promotes overconfidence is the falsification of history, which occurs when people misremember the past. Humans naturally have a difficult time recognizing inconsistencies in their thoughts and beliefs, as well as admitting to their own mistakes. When their views change over time, sometimes they will revise the past into something more self-flattering without even realizing they're doing it. People are bad at predicting the future and assessing probability. The human mind does not have an intuitive grasp of probability and risk. One reason is the illusion of control. People like to feel as though they are in control, so they mistakenly believe they can influence outcomes over which they have little to no influence. Another reason that people don't have a good grasp of probability is that the human mind is naturally averse to uncertainty. Most people are more inclined to take big risks with fast results than to take a wait-and-see approach that requires a tolerance for uncertainty. Another reason why people have difficulty assessing probability is that the brain responds to the magnitude of an event rather than its likelihood. This makes it difficult to assess threats properly. For instance, many people are so frightened by radioactivity that their brains don't functionally distinguish between 1% and 99% likelihoods of contamination. Both possibilities seem equally frightening. Another example is that people tend to worry about plane crashes as much or more than car crashes, because plane crashes receive a lot of spectacular media coverage. Yet statistically speaking, planes are much safer than cars. Another reason that people are bad at making predictions is the existence of black swans, or previously unimaginable events that nevertheless occur. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 were unforeseen and changed the world in profound ways. It's nearly impossible to predict such outlier events, which always lends an element of uncertainty to the future that the human mind is loath to recognize. A final obstacle the human mind faces when attempting to assess probability is the potential for an uneven distribution. An increasing number of phenomena can't be understood with the concept of an average. For example, consider the question of how many views the average website receives on an average day. The premise of the question is flawed because there is no such thing as an average website. The massive volume of traffic to websites like Wikipedia or the New York Times would obscure the fact that most websites receive relatively little traffic. Since the traffic distribution between large or lavishly funded websites on the one hand and small or seldomly updated websites on the other is so skewed, the average isn't a meaningful number in this context. The human mind seeks out patterns even when there are none. Correlation doesn't prove causation, but it's easy to confuse the two phenomena. Correlation simply means that two events or trends are connected, whereas causation indicates there is a cause and effect relationship between them. Sometimes people infer connections where there is, in fact, no connection at all. For instance, a man who thinks of an old friend with whom he hasn't spoken in years might receive a phone call from the friend in that exact moment. The friends may mistake the incident for telepathy when, in fact, it was sheer coincidence. The brain seeks out a pattern because it's difficult for it to grasp that improbable events can and do occur purely by chance. Instead, the brain mistakenly imbues random occurrences with special hidden meanings in an effort to make them fit a pattern. The phenomenon of regression to the mean is one reason that people mistakenly infer causation where none exists. For example, a person who goes to the chiropractor may attribute decreased pain to the practitioner when the fact is that extreme pain, much like extreme weather or extreme stock market performance, tends to be short-lived. The person suffering pain would have eventually felt relief with or without the chiropractor's services. Regression to the mean also means that when a region experiences unseasonably warm weather for a period of time, it's a safe bet that the temperature will drop closer to the average after a few days. Other times, a cause and effect relationship might indeed be accurate, but onlookers pin all the blame onto one cause when, in fact, a multitude of causes played a role. For instance, many people tried to discern a single motivation behind the 2003 Iraq War when it was actually driven by many different factors. The same is true of tragedies like school shootings or success stories like companies that make a lot of money. It's better to study successes and failures as complex phenomena informed by many motivations rather than overstating the importance of a single factor. The manner in which information is presented affects how it is interpreted and remembered. Information can often be communicated in more than one way, and the way information is framed will shape the reaction and choices of the person who receives it. For instance, a doctor can frame the risk of a surgery as a survival rate, which has a positive connotation, or a mortality rate, which is negative. The same risk will feel more alarming to the patient when it is framed as a mortality rate, because the prospect of death is vivid and frightening, whereas remaining alive is the status quo. The order in which information is presented is another type of possible framing. First and last impressions often matter most. The primacy effect dictates that information that comes first in a sequence holds a special place in people's memories. The primacy effect is especially important in social interactions like job interviews. The first candidate who impresses the interviewer is more likely to get hired than another good candidate who is interviewed later in the process. Last impressions also matter due to the recency effect, which says that people remember recent information better than old information. Another form of framing is the contrast effect, according to which judgments are situational, not absolute. For example, a product that has been reduced from $50 to $25 might seem more appealing than a similar product that has always cost $25. The contrast effect also means that an outdoor swimming pool filled with lukewarm water might feel piping hot to a swimmer on a cold day. It's always important to consider the ways that information is framed because it can easily skew perception. Emotion is often more powerful than logic. Many decisions are influenced by emotions, not logical thought. But this problem is so insidious that it can be difficult to recognize. One cognitive error along these lines that the human brain routinely commits is the sunk cost fallacy, which people fall for when they have invested too much time or money into a lost cause. The costs of the past are irrelevant to today's decisions. Only future costs and future benefits or losses matter. But it can be difficult to remain objective in such situations, such as during the Vietnam War, when the United States stayed long after its involvement had plainly failed. A phenomenon related to the sunk cost fallacy is effort justification. For instance, a person who builds a table may feel the piece is more valuable than an expensive piece of furniture because of the effort that was invested into the task. Another common cognitive error that is caused by emotion is the endowment effect, which leads people to overvalue their own possessions. For example, on the housing market, sellers often feel their house should be worth more than market price because of their personal attachment to it. Envy is a cognitive error that's informed by emotion. In the prehistoric world, envy served a practical purpose. It made people take action if someone else commandeered more than their fair share of resources. But in the contemporary world, envy is just a distraction that should be suppressed or ignored. Emotions shouldn't dictate all decisions, but that doesn't mean that emotions should always be ignored. Emotions are a form of information processing that the brain conducts separately from rational thought. It's most helpful to think of emotions as a biased source of information that should be considered in conjunction with other data, rather than allowed to overcome reason entirely.